Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and begin, and thank you all for coming today. This is an incredible honor to be able to speak at one of my favorite places on campus, if not my favorite place on campus, which is the downtown campus library, and then to be asked to speak on the last lecture series. It's just an incredible honor, and I'm very grateful. And so without further ado, I'm going to briefly introduce myself and then jump into what I'll be talking about. You can see my title here, but I am Scott Matthews. I teach American history here at the downtown campus, occasionally as well at the South campus. I teach classes on U.S. history, African American history, and more recently Jacksonville history. And I have students from my Jacksonville history class, my current African American history class, Marie, and then B in my American history class, and this is Carson. He is now a UNF student, and then my mom is here, and then Beth from the library is here, Carrie. So we're an intimate group, but I hope y'all on video will enjoy this as well. So when I was asked to give this talk, part of the last lecture series, it prompted me to think about ultimate questions. If I was looking back at my career as an historian, what did I hope to take from it? And I began to think that ultimately, as I reflect back on my career as an historian, both as a researcher, a writer, and a teacher, that if all my career was the collection of facts and information, an understanding of different interpretations of American history, then it really would have been all for naught if I didn't take from it something deeper and more fundamental. And so today I'm going to ask a question, and this is really, other than perhaps one of the other most fundamental questions, why is there something rather than nothing? The question I'm going to try to ask today and use history to get at it is, why are we here? What is the meaning and purpose of life? This is a question historians typically do not ask and do not answer because they are bound by evidence, and this is a kind of metaphysical question. And so I'm taking a different tack, though. I am looking at myself now, hypothetically, as if I'm at the end of my life and my career. What do I want history to have taught me? And so what I'm going to be arguing today is by looking at just three people who have had a tremendous impact on my life as an historian. And these people are Bob Moses, a civil rights worker, Elisabeth Abegg, who was a German Quaker Christian during World War II in Nazi Germany, and Janina Mehlberg, a Polish Jew. By looking at these three people's lives, people who I've read about throughout my career as an historian, I have come to understand what life is ultimately about. Now, what I'll be emphasizing today is that when I talk about meaning and purpose in life, I am talking about something that is not merely meaning and value or purpose that we create. That is instead, the meaning and purpose I am talking about today is transcendent. It is inherent in the universe. It is in existence throughout time and eternity. It is present at the cosmic level as well as at the quantum level. And the other thing I want to emphasize here today is that my understanding of the ultimate meaning of life or ultimate purpose also draws from my religious faith. I am a Christian. I am both a Presbyterian and also a Quaker. You'll be hearing a lot about Quakers today. And so it is undeniable that my religious faith is going to shed light on my understanding of ultimate meaning. But I also want to emphasize that I have come to this realization of life's ultimate meaning not merely from my religious faith and reading, but also from my study of history. There's an intersection there that I hope will become evident. One of the things I'm going to be emphasizing today is that for me, and I'm going to be using three Greek words today in my set up my topic, and I'll explain what those Greek words mean, and we'll move on. But for me, history, studying history, reading history is apocalyptic. And I don't mean that in the sense that reading and learning about the dark passages of history makes you fearful and pessimistic about our world and its eventual end. I rather mean apocalyptic in its original Greek meaning. Apocalypsis, which means to uncover, to unveil, to reveal. And in studying history, therefore, has been a kind of apocalyptic experience. It has revealed, unveiled the deeper truths of humanity. And for me, this is critically important because, as Joseph Heller, the novelist, once said, history is nothing more than a trash bag of random coincidences torn open in the wind. And it's easy to see history as just a cacophony, a complexity of voices and events, and how do you draw meaning from it. But at a fundamental level, when I tell my students, and I hope I convey this in some small way, at the end of the day, history is fundamentally about how human beings make or discover meaning in their lives. And that has been the most important thing for me in my life as an historian. So now we come to this question and the big revelation. I'm going to tell you all the meaning and purpose of life. You didn't know that perhaps coming in, but you're going to leave here having all your answers. And, well, not really. These are what I believe. These are my fundamental beliefs. This is what I believe is inherent and transcendent in not only human society, but in the universe. But I want to also dial it back with some modesty and say, I may be wrong, but this is what I feel internally through my study of history. So, what is the ultimate meaning and purpose of life? There are two other words, kenosis and agape, and they are interrelated. Both of these words I gathered through my life as a Christian, but they have taken on new meaning and can be applied to other people regardless of their religious faith and background. So what I believe is that at the root of our existence, the meaning of our existence, the purpose of our existence is first kenosis. And what is kenosis? Kenosis means self-denial for the sake of the other. It means emptying oneself in the original Greek. And if you are knowledgeable about the Bible, perhaps the most famous example of kenosis is in Philippians 2, verses 5 through 7, when Jesus performs a kind of kenotic act. That is, he denies equality with God. He empties himself, quote, taking the form of a slave. Now, kenosis necessarily then sets the groundwork for agape love. You oftentimes hear that there are multiple kinds of love. Sometimes people speak of 4 kinds of love. There is erotic love, the love you feel for your husband or wife or partner. There is filial love, the love you feel for a brother or a friend. There is the love that is parental love, we might say, a love that a parent has for her son or for a father towards his daughter. And then there is agapic love. And agapic love is universal love. Agapic love is a self-denying, empathetic, nonviolent, and sacrificial love that seeks the highest good for others in unity with them. And this reaches its final culmination in a willingness of someone to give their life for another through nonviolent means. And of course, once again, for me as a Christian, from the Bible, this comes in the form of John 15:13. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Now, in each of these 3 people I'm going to be discussing today, we see examples of kenosis and agape. Now, none of these 3 individuals will die in their life in service of another, but all 3 risk their lives and very easily could have died in their service to another. I will highlight examples of people related to them who did give their lives in a willing, self-sacrificial manner. But these 3 people, from very different backgrounds, nevertheless, all demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice even unto death for the well-being of another. Now, again, how do I know that this, in my heart, is the ultimate meaning of life? Now, I already said this meaning, one test of the ultimate meaning of life is that it has to apply not just to one particular sect or religion, but to all people. And I want to give you an example of just what I'm talking about. One of the most influential books for me when thinking about the relationship between science and religion and these ultimate questions of meaning and ethics is from this book, On the Moral Nature of the Universe. I am not going to get into the science here, But they make a very persuasive case. George Ellis at the bottom is a Quaker. Nancy Murphy at the top is a German Brethren, or from the German Brethren Church. That's basically the German Baptist Church, but they are both scientists. George Ellis is a cosmologist. Nancy Murphy, a philosopher and theologian. But George Ellis was once giving a talk on this book in which he argues as well, the ultimate meaning of life is kenosis and agapic love. That is, it is emptying ourselves in service to others. And he says we see it at the most cosmic scales and at the quantum scale. So one day when George Ellis was giving this talk, afterwards a man walked up to him and said, "Professor Ellis, you sounded today like a Muslim." Professor Ellis, of course, is a Quaker Christian, and he thought, well, here's some parallels between how I'm thinking as a Christian and what this Muslim understands to be fundamental. Another time, George Ellis was in England, and he heard the Rabbi Jonathan Sacks give a talk. And Rabbi Sacks was the chief rabbi in Great Britain from the 90s up to the 2010s, I believe. And afterwards, George Ellis walked up to Rabbi Sacks and said, "Rabbi Sacks, you sounded today like a Quaker Christian." And so here you have these parallels when you speak in the language of kenosis and agape. It's clear the evidence where it comes from in Christianity, but these ideas of self-sacrificial love pervade human experience. And if you ask George Ellis and Nancy Murphy, they pervade the cosmos, from planets and stars down to the quantum level in ways that I don't have time to get into today. So where I want to finish here before I jump into my three examples is how have I personally felt this as an historian? That I know intuitively, I know not just intellectually, but emotionally, that this is a deep, fundamental truth of what it means to be human, what meaning and purpose is. Well, I know that because when I read about people like Bob Moses, Elisabeth Abegg, and Janina Mehlberg, I've experienced what can only be called awe. And in fact, I've experienced what the psychologist Dr. Keltner calls an experience of moral beauty. Dr. Keltner recently published this book, Awe, the New Science of Everyday Wonder and How It Can Transform Your Life. And he says, what is the most common experience of awe we as human beings feel? Just recently, y'all might have seen the solar eclipse, and you heard people talking in terms of awe. If you have ever been in totality, the language people use is just one of wonder and awe, and just looking through it with sunglasses, you could see a partial eclipse, and that made people feel awe. Well, Keltner says, in fact, awe of nature is not the most common kind of awe we experience. In fact, the most common form of awe we feel is when we see courageous and selfless acts that human beings perform on behalf of others, particularly when they are risking everything. That, Keltner says, is oftentimes one of the most common experiences of awe, and there are physical manifestations. And for me, when I'm reading about the people I'm going to discuss today, I can feel within myself something begin to slow down. I pause, I reread a chapter, or I reread the sentence in which they have done something that I find awesome. Sometimes I will then sit in silence and meditate on what they have said and done. And sometimes I can feel tears welling up in my eyes. And it's that emotional experience of awe that allows me to know that I'm touching on something more fundamental and more meaningful, something perhaps elemental about life itself. So when did this begin? For me, as an historian, it began in 11th grade. And I remember I was at the Mandarin Library, and I was there doing a research project for a paper that I was not very enthusiastic about for an English class. But I discovered this book on the right. It was on a shelf in the Mandarin Library, and I picked it up. And this is a book about the civil rights movement, and specifically, is it about these three men, Michael Schwerner, who is here at the left, James Chaney, who is here in the center, and Andrew Goodman. In 1964, these three men, two Jewish men from New York and a black man from Mississippi, they were part of the civil rights movement, and they were investigating a church that had been burned in Mississippi by the Klan. It was burned because they were holding voter registration meetings there. And these three civil rights workers were helping this church form voter registration groups so that black people in Mississippi could get registered to vote and change the Jim Crow system. Well, the police and the Klan in this particular area of Mississippi knew these three men were coming to town. They ambushed them and murdered them. And I remember as an 11th grader reading about this. I was a person who had a fascination with the civil rights movement and Southern history, but these three young men who were willingly, in some sense, putting themselves in danger and who gave their lives, it had an immense impact on me. And it opened up my interest in the history of the civil rights movement, which I continue to teach today. That led me then, in my senior year of high school, to this book, Memories of the Southern Civil Rights Movement, a book by a photographer named Danny Lyon, with a foreword by a man named Julian Bond. This book was a sort of visual story of the civil rights movement. And I learned about people like Bob Moses and a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And immediately I was taken with this man, Bob Moses, who you can see here in the center. Bob Moses becomes one of these central figures in the history of the civil rights movement. And it was his character, his personality, and what he did that transformed my life in so many fundamental ways. And I'm just going to talk about a few. First off, who was Bob Moses? So Bob Moses was born in 1935 in Harlem, New York, was an extraordinarily bright student, though he grew up in a very poor part of Harlem. He went to Hamilton College in New York, a very elite school in New York, and eventually he went to Harvard, where he was in graduate school for philosophy. While at Harvard, he studied Albert Camus, the French novelist and philosopher, and was immediately taken by Camus' existential philosophy. Camus said, rather than taking a nihilistic view of life, Camus said, we create meaning in our life by following our conscience. When we follow our conscience, when we act decisively, and oftentimes in situations that involve risk, we create meaning. That's how we create meaning. And we set a pattern, we set an example. It is by our actions we allow others to lead a similar life. You lead by example and not by coercion, not by a force of will, but by your conscience and the fruits of that conscience. While at Harvard, Bob Moses also began to worship with a group of Christians known as Quakers. And Quakers believe fundamentally that there is something called the inner light, that every human being has something called the inner light, and that what we might call sometimes that of God in everybody. They believe fundamentally in the equality and divinity of every human being, and that leads them to have not only great respect for all people, even people who do evil things. It leads them to a belief in nonviolence, but nonviolence in an effort to bring about a better, more peaceful and just world. Their religious faith is directly tied to living that out in the world and being examples. And so Bob Moses is taking what he learned from Albert Camus, from Quakerism, and he has that swirling in his head. And then one day he sees a photograph. And the photograph Bob Moses sees is of 4 North Carolina A&T college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sitting in at a lunch counter at a Woolworth's diner. So in 1960, these 4 men basically launch what becomes the student sit-in movement. And Bob Moses looked at them and said, here are 4 men who are following what Albert Camus calls us to do. Against all odds and risks, the risks of violence, the risk of imprisonment, these 4 men are literally putting their bodies on the line for something greater than themselves. And Bob Moses looked into their eyes and said, why am I not doing that too? That should be me. And so what Bob Moses does is that he goes south and he joins a new civil rights organization that is leading the sit-in movement. And this civil rights organization is called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. A mouthful, but that is what SNCC stands for, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And you can see it was an interracial group, but primarily made up of black people, both high school and college students. And Bob Moses was the first to say, okay, sitting in at lunch counters, demanding service regardless of your race, that is important. But unless we address a fundamental issue, and that is political power, democratic justice, real change will not come. And so Bob Moses, while most of the young people with SNCC are still sitting in at lunch counters and participating in the freedom rides, Bob Moses says we need to go to the most resistant and violent state in the Union to get voting rights to change America. And so in 1961, Bob Moses leaves New York and he comes south to work for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee with the issue of voting rights. Let me just briefly go back a second because I want to give you a sense of what SNCC stood for and how it reflects some of who Bob Moses was. Moses did not write the statement of purpose by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960, but it very much fits who he was and what he believed and what many others in the early civil rights movement believed. And so this is what SNCC said their statement of purpose is, and I'll just read it. We affirm the philosophical or religious ideal of nonviolence as the foundation of our purpose, the presumption of our faith, and the manner of our action. Nonviolence, as it grows from the Judeo-Christian tradition, seeks a social order permeated by love. Through nonviolence, courage displaces fear, love transforms hate, acceptance dissipates prejudice, hope ends despair, peace dominates war, justice for all overcomes injustice. Love is the central motif of nonviolence. Such love goes to the extreme. It remains loving and forgiving even in the midst of hostility. It matches the capacity of evil to inflict suffering with an even more enduring capacity to absorb evil, all the while persisting in love. That is in many ways an extraordinarily eloquent reflection of this idea of kenosis and agape. And of course, SNCC was not the only organization to express this. Martin Luther King and his group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also spoke in similar terms about nonviolence. But I want to highlight this to give you a sense of what the atmosphere, so to speak, that Moses was operating in some of his ideas. So I said what Moses did, and I remember feeling this awe that he would even consider doing this, is that Moses was basically told by a lot of people in the movement, you ever try to go into Mississippi and you ever try to start registering black people to vote, you basically are signing your own death warrant. Moses understood this. And then when he expressed interest to do that, people would say, okay, if you're going to do this, there's one place you do not want to go, and that is southwest Mississippi. These counties here along the Mississippi-Louisiana border, those are some of the most violent and resistant places in the entire United States. And if you do it, you're going to be going alone. And if you go alone, your life is truly in jeopardy. But Moses had heard that there were farmers like E.W. Steptoe who were living in counties like Amite County. And they were saying, we hear that SNCC is beginning to move their operations into the South. Well, don't forget about us. E.W. Steptoe was a member of the NAACP, and he was trying to get people to register to vote, but he was facing constant barriers. Amite County had about 6,000 black people living in it in 1961. One person was registered to vote. A campaign of violent intimidation had been going on for more than 90 years, and Moses says, they're asking for our help. What else can I do? And no one wanted to follow Moses, so he went alone. This New Yorker, this black man from New York, goes alone to Amite County to work with E.W. Steptoe and begin to register people to vote. That mere act, I remember reading about it and knowing something about the social history of these areas of the Deep South, that was just an extraordinary act of courage, in many ways of selflessness, totally out of the limelight, and totally in many ways forgotten for a period of time. So Moses is there by himself alone, and one day, along with E.W. Steptoe and a few other black men, they decide to go to the county courthouse in Amite County at Liberty. And before they get to Liberty, before they get to the Amite County courthouse, they are pulled over by the sheriff of Amite County. He knows, because he sees the local black men in the car, he knows the direction they're driving, he knows they're going to the courthouse, and he knows they're going to try to register to vote. The sheriff tells Moses, the man driving the car, get out of the car. What are you doing? Billy Jack Caston, the sheriff, says to Moses, and Moses, before he can answer, is hit by Caston with the butt of Caston's knife on his temple. Moses collapses to the ground as Caston continues to beat him over the head, and blood is pouring from Moses' head. The men are shouting at the sheriff to stop. The men are enraged. They are calling for retribution, and Moses says, no, we must forgive this man, but we must not submit. It becomes legendary. It's almost Christ-like to an extent that Moses abhorred to ever have been compared, but people are saying, who is this man who comes into Illuminate County, who is willing to lead people to register to vote, knowing full well it might cost him his life, who is bloodied about the head by the sheriff, who is willing to forgive, but is saying, we are not going to stop. And Moses gets his head bandaged. They basically create a tourniquet around his head, and Moses insists they drive onto the courthouse after having been beaten by the sheriff. They arrive at the courthouse, and Moses still has blood pouring down his face. And the mere sight of Moses by the county courthouse registrar leads her to panic, and she immediately shuts down the courthouse, and the courthouse is closed for days. But Moses' willingness to go into Mississippi to do this earned him a tremendous amount of respect, particularly from the local black people in that section of Mississippi. And this is what Moses said when people asked him, why did you do this? From a human point of view, Moses said, these people like E.W. Steptoe, had greater needs than almost any other place in the United States. And from a psychological point of view, where the whole problem in Mississippi and the South is pervaded by fear, if you turn down the tough areas like Southwest Mississippi, the people would lose faith and confidence in you. Journalist Jack Newfield in the 1960s said this about what Moses did. Bob Moses' decision to move into Southwest Mississippi was perhaps the most creative and heroic single act anyone attempted in the 1960s. Certainly much of the subsequent history of the civil rights movement flowed from that existential act of disappearing alone into the most violent and desolate section of Mississippi. As you can see, Bob Moses not only took the men to register, tried to at least, and though Moses expressed personal forgiveness towards Caston, he also believed that it was important for him to show other black Mississippians that you should bring people to justice when they commit acts of violence. And so Moses did something that no black person had ever done in the history of Illuminate County. He brought up charges against a white person, and that being the sheriff. Of course, the jury in Illuminate County very quickly acquitted Billy Jack Caston of any responsibility, and Moses knew that was going to happen, but he wanted to show not just people in Illuminate County, but America, that no longer would they be tolerating and submitting to such brutal acts of violence, even if they chose never to return violence with violence. Last thing about Bob Moses before I move on to Elisabeth Abegg. Just a couple of months later, Bob Moses is in Macomb, Mississippi, which is to the east of Illuminate County. And it's in Macomb, a larger town in Mississippi, where SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, are leading sit-ins at restaurants, at bus stations, but they're also, particularly young people, high school and junior high school students, they're organizing voter registration movements. And sometimes they are protesting out in front of City Hall. And one day, Bob Moses is out in front of City Hall, and he's there with some of the local black people, and particularly the youths in Macomb, but also some of the white members of SNCC. And they are out demanding an end to segregation in downtown facilities when suddenly a mob appears. And this mob attacks Bob Moses, and they attack one of his friends, a white man named Bob Zellner. And as Bob Zellner is being attacked, the mob grabs Zellner's eyeball and begins, as Moses saw, ripping it out of its socket. And before it was completely removed from its socket, Moses jumped onto Bob Zellner, covered Bob Zellner, and for about a few minutes absorb all of the blows that would have been on Bob Zellner's already badly beaten body. Once again, no one was arrested for this act of violence. In fact, a few weeks later, Bob Moses was himself arrested for contributing to the delinquency of minors because there were young people out protesting on the steps of City Hall that day. So Bob Moses finds himself in jail, and while in jail, Bob Moses writes what I would argue is the second most famous letter in the history of the civil rights movement, the first being Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail in 1963. In this letter from 1961, Bob Moses, in many ways, created almost a myth of himself and the movement, but one I would argue is more than just a myth. There's an element here of truth that reveals the deeper meaning of the civil rights movement, one that I would argue connects back to what I believe is the meaning of life. I'm just going to read not all of this, but just a portion of it. So Bob Moses is in this prison in Magnolia, Mississippi, the county seat of Pike County, where Macomb is, and he's with some of his fellow civil rights activists. He says, "I am writing this note from the drunk tank of the county jail in Magnolia, Mississippi. 12 of us are here, sprawled along a concrete bunker. I'm sitting with smuggled pen and paper, thinking a little, writing a little. Later on, Hollis Watkins will lead out in a clear tenor into a freedom song, and Chuck McDew will discourse on the history of the black man and Jew. McDew, a black by birth, a Jew by choice, and a revolutionary by necessity, has taken the deep hates and loves of America and the world, reserved for those who dare to stand in a strong sun and cast a sharp shadow. This is Mississippi, the middle of the iceberg. Hollis is leading off with his tenor. Michael, row the boat ashore, alleluia. Christian brothers, don't be slow, alleluia. Mississippi is the next to go, alleluia. This is a tremor in the middle of the iceberg from a stone that the builders rejected." That last line, from a stone that the builders rejected, is Moses drawing from the book of Psalms, Psalm 118:22, "The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone," something that Christ in the book of Matthew also talks about. The stone that the builders rejected will be the chief cornerstone. Those who are rejected now, those who have been on the periphery, those who have been persecuted and marginalized, those who have been on the bottom, they will become the foundation for a new world rooted in equality and love. For the civil rights movement, for many people, they began to speak about this new society, and they called it the beloved society, one based not on violence but on love, based upon kenosis and agape. To conclude the section on Moses, I go back to that book I mentioned just a minute ago, Memories of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Danny Lyon, the photographer, had great admiration for Moses. And this is what Danny Lyon said, and I remember reading this in the book when I was in high school and college, and it had an immense impact on me. Lyon said, "Moses and others like him in the movement, theirs is a story of absolute courage, of Americans, black and white, Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant, literally ready to die for the ideas that this country has always claimed it stood for, but in its history has actually never practiced." All right. I'm now going to move on to Elisabeth Abegg, and here I move into the Quaker history section. I've already mentioned that Moses had a Quaker background, but when I was applying for college, I discovered a college in North Carolina called Guilford College. Guilford College is a Quaker school in Greensboro, where the first sit-in movement occurred. And I chose Guilford because of its Quaker history. Quakers had been at the forefront of the abolitionist movement. Guilford College had actually been a stop on the Underground Railroad. They had been a voice of conscience during wars for peace, and I was deeply attracted to Quakerism as a form of Christianity, and remain so today. And I remember before I went, I purchased this book, Quakers and Nazis, Inner Light and Outer Darkness. And it is there that I learned of these extraordinary stories of what Quakers did in Germany during World War II, particularly for the Jews of Germany. What I learned is that Quakers, when the war broke out, when the Second World War broke out in 1939, there were only 275 Quakers in all of Germany. Germany had a population of 71 million. So what possibly could this small sect have done to have any effect? Well, in reality, no other group did more, particularly for Jews in Nazi Germany, than the Quakers. No other religious group did more. And I want to talk just a little bit about one example, and that example is this woman on the left, Elisabeth Abegg. So in 1933, when the Nazis came to power, Elisabeth Abegg was a Quaker, and the Quaker meeting, the main Quaker meeting for Germany, said this with the rise of Hitler and with the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. As members of the German Quaker Church, we must now put aside our fears. What are the basic and essential tasks laid on us as friends? Quakers call each other friends. We are not merely a peace society or a humanitarian welfare organization. The Religious Society of Friends, Quakers, is a community of men and women who are striving to express in their lives their faith in the direct relationship of people to God. There can be no gap between our religious convictions and our actions. Others need us and need to have faith in us. So what then did the Quakers do before I talk about Abegg? Well, little things at first. They refused to take the Quaker oath. They refused ever to salute using Heil Hitler, which in itself was an act that was shocking to many people because most people did that, and if you did not do it, you brought attention to yourself as if you were not loyal and patriotic. Quakers refused to perform military service that would involve the killing of another human being. Quakers were actively involved in what was called the Kinder Transport, that is, organizing a network of people who would help move Jewish children out of Germany, particularly to Great Britain, for safety. Quaker men and women were active in compiling care packages, which they sent to concentration camps in Poland for Jewish prisoners. Quakers visited other Jews in their homes when people looked at them as pariahs. They patronized their stores when others were implementing boycotts against Jewish business owners. They also hid Jews in their homes, an act that could get them arrested and sent to camps themselves. And in some cases, Quakers willingly chose to go to concentration and death camps with Jews themselves, knowing that in doing that they were likely to die, in some cases knowing that they would die. There is a case of a Quaker named Elisabeth Abegg who by 1943 understood when the transport said it was going to Poland, she knew it was going to either Auschwitz, perhaps Treblinka, Sobibor, where women like her of her age would die. And she made the decision, rather than to leave behind her Jewish friends, to go to Auschwitz, where she died next to them in the gas chamber. There is another example of this. It's a woman named Edith Stein, who was born a German Jew. She later converted to Catholicism. She became a Carmelite nun. Well, in 1942, when the Nazis were coming, Edith Stein was told by the Carmelite order, we can move you out, we can save you, we can send you off to somewhere else in Europe, maybe Switzerland, maybe even to Great Britain. You do not have to go because the Nazis are looking for you. You may be a Catholic now, but you are still a Jew in their eyes. And Edith Stein looked at them and said, if I left and found my freedom and safety, it would be my utter annihilation. For her, as it was for Elisabeth Abegg, utter annihilation was their own safety and own security. Their life only had meaning when they chose, as Edith Stein said, to suffer with my people. And she willingly, knowingly went to Auschwitz and died in the concentration camp. I should say died in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. Now, Elisabeth Abegg did not do that, but Elisabeth Abegg did extraordinary work that I want to highlight here before I move on to our last example. Elisabeth Abegg was born in 1882. She came from a long line of theologians, but she herself, this is where I kind of felt an alliance with her, not only is she a Quaker, but very rare thing for a woman in early 20th century Germany, she went to get her PhD in history and graduated with her PhD in history in 1916, so right as World War I is going on. After World War I, Elisabeth Abegg joined the Quakers, both German Quakers, American Quakers, and English Quakers, in a massive feeding program. Germany was in ruins after World War I. It was economically devastated. There was a lack of supplies, a lack of food. Particularly families and children were starving, and the Quakers played an outsized role in feeding starving children. Here were, particularly remarkably, American and English Quakers who had been supposedly on the other side of the war going and feeding people that their nations had once deemed enemies. Quakers said, you move to the suffering regardless of who the people are, regardless if they had been enemy combatants in an immoral war. And so Elisabeth Abegg was part of that. But with the rise of the Nazis, Elisabeth Abegg began to confront a new quandary. She was now a history teacher in Berlin, and she was at a school where she was teaching both Christian and Jewish students. But eventually, Jewish students were removed from the schools. But Elisabeth Abegg kept up her sympathy for the Jews in Germany. She routinely talked to her students, now her exclusively Christian students, about how it is their obligation to seek reconciliation with their enemies in war. It was their obligation as human beings to seek reconciliation with the English and reconciliation with the French. And by this point, also reconciliation with the Soviet Union. And the students went home and told their parents, and their parents were infuriated. Then they heard stories about how Elisabeth Abegg said, it is your obligation to show empathy for the Jews who are being persecuted in their midst. The children went home and told their parents were enraged. And Elisabeth Abegg, for this very reason, show reconciliation, show empathy, she lost her job and was routinely interrogated by the Gestapo. She was brought in by the Gestapo, asked about her pacifist beliefs, asked about her sympathy and empathy for the Jews, and told in no uncertain terms, pacifism and empathy for the Jews can get you killed. And yet she persisted. In 1942, there was a turning point for Elisabeth Abegg. One of her dearest and closest friends, Anna Hirschberg, a Jewish woman from Berlin, was arrested and transported to Auschwitz, where she died in a gas chamber. And for Elisabeth Abegg, this was the turning point. This was no longer an abstraction. People that she knew and loved were dying. And so she turned her 3-room flat in Berlin, where she lived with her disabled and ailing sister, Julia, and her mother, who was 86 years old. Elisabeth Abegg never married. She had no children, but she lived in this tiny apartment in Berlin. And despite the burdens of caring for an 86-year-old mother and an ailing sister, she turned that 3-room flat into a sanctuary for Jews who had nowhere else to go. At the very same time, she actively coordinated a series of other safe houses in Berlin where other Jews who could not all fit in her apartment could find sanctuary and safety as well. During World War II, Elisabeth Abegg personally housed 12 Jews in her apartment and provided safe housing for 80 others, all of whom survived. In addition to that, Elisabeth Abegg went around the city. She went and visited particularly Jewish children. She brought their families money. She brought them forged ID papers that might have helped them get out of Germany. She sat with them and taught them school lessons that she knew they were missing because they were no longer permitted to go to school. She also would hold Friday evening dinners for the Jews who were about to celebrate the Sabbath. She was doing this knowing full well that all of her neighbors around her were increasingly looking at her with suspicion, not only for what it seemed as though she was doing, but also the fact that she was one of the very, very few people who did not fly a Nazi flag from her balcony, did not put it on her car, believed it was idolatry, and chose not to do it. Well, for her, that was another source of suspicion. But she carried herself, as I'm going to show here in a minute, with supreme confidence and composure and calmness. Even if that wasn't what she felt inside, it was something that others looked at her who may have resented what she was doing, but themselves did not have the ability to counter what they saw in her, which was this confidence and resolve. She also sold all of her mother's, her own jewelry, and her sister's jewelry to smuggle a Jew from Germany across the border into Switzerland. And again, this is just an extraordinary story. So I want to, before I conclude with Elisabeth Abegg, read you some descriptions of some of the people she helped save, their descriptions of Elisabeth Abegg. When Ludwig Kollm and his wife were ordered to report for deportation to Poland, they instead found their way to Abegg's apartment and nervously rang the bell. But, Ludwig Kollm said, I relaxed when a white-haired lady with benign, well-balanced features opened the door and immediately let me in. I didn't have to tell her much about our suffering. She already knew of the problems we faced. She said at once warmly that she would help us in any way. With tears in her eyes, my wife thanked her for her help. Dr. Abegg demurred, saying, we, the German Christians, are in your debt. We have so much to atone for. Another Jewish woman named Charlotte Herzfeld, who was rescued by Abegg after her parents committed suicide. It was very common for Jewish people to commit suicide, not only after Kristallnacht, but well into the deportations that were occurring in the 1940s. Herzfeld said later of Abegg, you were there, calm, serene, courageous. I regained trust. I sensed warmth. I felt safe. Yitzhak Schwarzen said, I always think of her as my guardian angel. In the midst of that terrible hell, she acted not for compensation or notice, but out of love for the persecuted. Elisabeth also helped this woman, Perelis Lisolate. Lisolate was, before the war, a German daycare worker and eventually learned and heard about what Elisabeth Abegg was doing and got connections. And Elisabeth Abegg encouraged Perelis Lisolate and her niece to find safe harbor in her home. Perelis wasn't sure if that was necessary. Elisabeth Abegg basically convinced her, this is your life. You and your niece must find a way to stay with me as long as you can, and if necessary, I will try to find you a way out of the country. In effect, because of what Elisabeth Abegg did, she saved Lisolate's life and that of her niece. After the war, Lisolate became a social worker in Germany, and at the very same time, Elisabeth Abegg adopted her as her daughter. So here was the very person Abegg helped save, who becomes her daughter. Abegg, who never married, who never had children. Lisolate, who herself did not marry and have children, now had a family with her rescuer. And Lisolate said, Elisabeth Abegg was always calm and kindly and completely fearless. On her 75th birthday, in 1957, some of the people Abegg had helped rescue presented her with a book. And it was a book of their memories of what she meant to them during this period of what they called terrible hell. And the title of the book was When One Light Pierced the Darkness. And among the many moving testimonies is this one from Herta Blumenthal. With Frau Abegg was revealed the truth that a life of love for one's fellow human beings, together with respect for others, is the most elevated and eternal value. Her rectitude, straightforwardness, and endless love will always be the model upon which I pattern my life and will come into play whenever anyone needs my help. 10 years later, Elisabeth Abegg was recognized by Yad Vashem, the organization in Israel dedicated to memorializing the victims of the Holocaust. Yad Vashem recognized Elisabeth Abegg as one of the righteous among the nations. That is an honorific bestowed on non-Jews who helped Jews at great danger to survive, or for a period of time survive, during the Holocaust. And Elisabeth Abegg was one of a number of other German Quakers who have that title of righteous among the nations. In 1947, Quakers received the Nobel Peace Prize for their work before World War II and during World War II. And again, remembering how tiny they were in Germany, 275 out of 71 million. 200,000 Quakers in the entire earth, and they were one of the only religious groups to be recognized with this Nobel Peace Prize because of what they did during World War II. When I read about Elisabeth Abegg, I have one of those moments where all I can do sometimes is sit, pause in silence, and experience that awe, that recognition of moral beauty. All right, I'm going to conclude today. I'm going to conclude my talk with Janina Mehlberg. This is an example of how a continuation of reading and lifelong learning reinforces what you had learned earlier in life. Bob Moses and the Quakers, those were things that I learned earlier in my career as an historian. This is a book I picked up about a month ago, and it was by happenstance. I was in one of my favorite bookstores other than Chamberlain Bookstore, which is just down the road. I was at a bookstore at the beach called The Bookmark, and they had this book on the shelf, and it so happened that the authors were coming the next day to give a talk about this book. And it was very interesting to me, so I just made it. I said, okay, well, I'm going to wait to not buy the book just yet, but I'll come listen to their talk. And I learned this extraordinary story about Janina Mehlberg, and I'm going to use this to conclude. Just as a way that this process, this experience of feeling awe, to understand what I believe to be the fundamental meaning of life and our purpose here, is constantly revealing itself through purposeful study. Very quickly, Janina Mehlberg is unique. I just told you about Elisabeth Abegg and the righteous among the nations who were recognized for rescuing Jews during the Holocaust. These were non-Jews rescuing Jews during the Holocaust. Well, Janina Mehlberg is an example of a Jew who rescued non-Jewish Poles, non-Jewish Polish people during World War II. So how in the world did this happen? During the Nazi occupation of Poland, Janina Mehlberg was very, very lucky. She came from a relatively well-to-do Polish family. And she was the only one, though, in her family who escaped the clutches of the Nazis. The rest of her family was arrested, eventually deported to death camps, and would die. But she had a relationship with a German nobleman and aristocrat, a Polish count. And this Polish count admired Janina Mehlberg because Janina was brilliant. She was a philosopher, a brilliant mathematician, had a charismatic personality. And so he went and got her forged papers. And the forged papers said that rather than Janina Mehlberg, or her born name, Pepi Spinner was her original born name, her new name would be Countess Janina Suchodolska. She becomes this Polish aristocrat. And therefore, the Nazis don't touch her, because not only now does she have papers that says she's a Polish aristocrat, she's multilingual. She knows Ukrainian, she knows German, she knows Russian, she knows Polish, she knows Yiddish. She can converse with anybody and with confidence. She has perfect German. And so the Germans look upon her, and the Germans who are obsessed with hierarchy and status don't want to challenge this woman, and her force of personality will be her asset. So for Janina Mehlberg, she quickly realizes that if her life is to have any meaning, and she knows that though she is now safe, the chances of her surviving are very, very slim. We know that before World War II, Poland had a Jewish population of about 3.5 million. Just over 90% of Poland's Jewish population is murdered during the Holocaust. And so Janina Mehlberg is a mathematician. She understands the scale, slowly but surely, the scale of what is happening to the Jews. She knows her family is lost, and she says, my life will have no meaning unless I do something to help others live. And what she did is that she joined the Polish resistance, and through the Polish resistance, she acquired supplies. And the place where she lived in Poland was a place called Lublin, Poland, and it was very close to a death and concentration camp called Majdanek. And so from Lublin, Janina routinely went to Majdanek, where in Majdanek, primarily for a period of time, there were Jewish prisoners, but also Polish prisoners. The Nazis would not allow her to bring supplies to the Jews, but at the same time it didn't matter because the Nazis were systematically murdering the Jewish prisoners at Majdanek. But they would allow her to bring supplies to the Polish people, people who were part of the resistance, or merely people who were in the way of German immigration into Poland. Germans were taking land from the Polish people and giving it to German migrants. And the people who refused to go off their land were thrown into prisons, men, women, and children, and the elderly. And so Janina said, these are people, and we need to know the Polish people, by and large, during this time were deeply anti-Semitic. Even though some did help Jews survive, many others were deeply anti-Semitic, and Janina knew that growing up in Poland, and yet she chose, despite that, as a Jewish woman, to go into a death camp where daily Jews were being murdered, and she saw the evidence of it everywhere, to nevertheless bring supplies to Polish men, women, and children who would have died without them. She brought untold amounts of bread, milk, medicine into Majdanek, all the while she was witnessing unimaginable horrors. Here's a photograph from Lublin where Countess Suchodolka lived, and she could daily see the smoke rising from the crematorium at Majdanek. There was one day in November of 1943 when the Nazis know that the Russians are coming from the east and they want to quickly end their mass murder of the Jews in Poland. And because Majdanek was in East Poland, this is one of the first places where this happened. They had 43,000 Jews in various camps around Majdanek. They all brought them to Majdanek in early November, and they proceeded to execute 43,000 Jewish men, women, and children in 24 hours. Unimaginable horror. And Janina knew that this was going on. She saw and heard the evidence of it. And within the next week, she, as a Jewish woman, was back at Majdanek bringing supplies to non-Jewish Poles. Her biographers say this about Janina Mehlberg and what she was doing. Where is that? It is almost impossible to fathom how Janina, conscious of being a Jew, dared to enter Majdanek over and over to deal with the SS officials there, especially after the mass murder of November 1943. And yet she continued to do that, willingly putting her life on the line. Her husband, Henry Mehlberg, who himself was a brilliant philosopher, and I'll talk about their afterlife here in just a little second. That is their afterlife after Poland. This is what Janina Mehlberg's husband said about her. She based her actions on a higher probability. One life was worth less than many. Against this probability, she operated for years, repeatedly risking death because the help she could give to others demanded the chance. Indeed, she could see no meaning to her life unless she risked. Despite the horrors that Mehlberg saw, she never lost her faith in humanity, as so many other people did who lived through the horrors of the war and the Holocaust. And I'm going to conclude today by reading Janina Mehlberg's words. And they reflect the awe that she felt, not at what she herself did, but at what she saw in the camp, in these unimaginable circumstances. And it's going to be what we said at the beginning, is the core meaning of our existence and purpose, kenosis and agape. Even in a place like Majdanek, it was still visible. And this is what she said about her own experience of awe. While physical and psychic tortures broke many in Majdanek, some reacted with what one can only call moral grandeur. She is here using language that Keltner used when talking about awe or experiences of moral beauty. She's calling it moral grandeur. I know of some and heard of many others who helped their fellow sufferers at the cost of their own lives. Those who confessed to others' crimes, those who willingly chose death over a degrading life. So the murder of goodness was not thorough, and in this fact too, it must be reported. So, what is the meaning and purpose of life? It is to empty ourselves, to live a life of sacrificial love for others, to create unity, to become beacons of light in and despite the darkness. And that light becomes the lamppost that lights the path for others to follow in the future. Thank you. All right, I don't know if there are questions, but I know I went a little long, but Carrie, do you ever do that? I don't know if that's a part of it, or is that?
That's fine, yeah, you do questions, if folks have questions, certainly.
Okay. Well, if you want to, you're welcome to, but if not, you can ask me in private. But
that was just wonderful. What tie did the book's author have to this area, or was there one which
these two authors? Elisabeth White used to be a historian at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, but she did not know Polish, and so she had to reach out to Joanna Sliwa, who is also a historian of the Holocaust, but who knew Polish. So all the documents in Polish, she kind of focused on those, and so they were a team in that regard. But the story is interesting because Elisabeth White, eventually, Henry Mehlberg, after Janina passes away, he moves to Gainesville and teaches philosophy at UF. And before he retired, he was looking at this memoir that his wife had written about her experiences at Majdanek. And he went to the history department at University of Florida and asked the chair, he said, do you think you could use this or do anything with it? And he said, well, I'm not really a historian of World War II or the Holocaust, so I don't know what I could do with it. And so he said, but I'll keep it. Well, the guy at UF forgot about it. And then when he was about to retire, he sent it to Elisabeth White, who read it and nearly fell over and said, this is one of the most extraordinary stories I've ever heard. How has no one done anything with her life story? But even she said, there was a lot that I could not know. And so because I didn't know Polish, I sat on it for a while. And then before Elisabeth White retired, she then said, it is my life's mission. This was divinely orchestrated for me to write. This story has to be told. And so that was in itself a kind of miracle about how we even have any idea about who she is today. It was because her husband had such great respect for her and thought her story cannot be forgotten. And thankfully, if it were not for Elisabeth White, she probably would have died with the memoir and it would have been totally gone. I don't know. I would assume she's probably still in the Washington area since she had worked at the museum there in DC. Yeah. But, yeah. All right, well, thank you all again. It's been an honor to do this. Thank you.